Hi, my name's Lou Debuseable. My sign name is this, and I work at the Thomas Patterson School, Bilingual School for Deaf Children, here at RIDBC. So I'm lecturing today, but before we start, I'd just like to put up a few, or three readings. You don't have to do these, but they're just ideas if you're interested. The first is about the structure of Auslan. It's good because it's very recent, but it is a little bit in-depth and complex. So if you see it and feel, oh my goodness, I can't understand it all, that's fine. It's worth it if you're interested, but have a look. The second one is about the acquisition of language from a different perspective to the traditional grammar view. And the third one is an excellent website called signlanguageassessment.info, I think, or something. Anyway, the link's up there, and it's by a man in Germany named Tobias Haug, and he has information on all of the different sign language assessments around the world, and he's always got a link, I think it's in the top right corner, to like a paper that gets updated sometimes about what you need for adaptation of sign language assessment tools or design, what issues there are in the design. So it's a good summary of some of what we're going to talk about today, and so probably worth looking at. So today we're going to focus on how we assess and teach, set up goals for children who use Auslan. Before I start, I want to say that Auslan signing children doesn't mean they only sign Auslan. Most of our children really have some hearing, some level of hearing, and some English, spoken English. Some of them access sound but don't speak. Some have some speech. Some are great with spoken English. But what they all have in common is that they use sign language as their primary language. So I'm going to talk about these 5 things, but the last 2 points I'm really only going to cover very briefly. So at the start, I'm going to cover a little bit about the structure of Auslan, because I know some of you watching me don't know Auslan or just know a small amount of it, and I think it's important that I describe a few things about the structure. Then we're going to talk about the issues with sign language assessment. Third, I'm going to show what tools we actually can use, what assessments we have, either made here in Australia or overseas. And then lastly, some ideas about how we set up specific goals for children and how we work with the children one-on-one or in small groups to target specific goals. Okay, so this is a very old-fashioned view of language. It's a model or a structure that fits very well with English and other European languages, but the more people researched around the world, linguists started researching around the world, especially sign languages, the more they realised that it doesn't match, it's not a good match. So you've maybe all heard of phonology, morphology, or syntax, I can't remember, there's a whole lot of signs people use for it. But it's really very hard to make sign languages fit that model. When you start collecting actual real data, like filming real data from language, you'll see that there's a lot more happening, and it's not clear, should it fit into that slot or that slot? Where would you put it? And so I'm going to show you like a different way of looking at languages that is a better fit for spoken and sign languages. The semiotic view of language says that signers or speakers have a whole range of different things that they can use to express a message. Some of those things are very conventionalized and fixed, and some of them less so. You can make up or adapt on the spot. So for example, you can see at the top of this, they are the most conventionalized things. They're very fixed, you can't change them. Well, you can change them, but nobody will understand you. And down the bottom, other things that are less conventionalized, so that you have a lot more flexibility with how you use them. So in English at the top, we have things like words you would find in a dictionary. If I wanted to talk about a table, for example, I can't decide, I'm actually going to call it a cable. It doesn't work. A table is everyone agrees that those sounds mean that thing. You can't change it. Then we have symbolic gestures, things like good, or, oh, for goodness sakes, or hi. They really are very fixed. There's one sign or gesture and one meaning. So I'm talking about spoken languages here, not sign languages. The gestures are very fixed and you can't change them. They have a meaning attached to them. They're very conventional. And when I was thinking about what we use in English, I have an Auslan one, but when I was thinking of, what would I put in the English one, things at the top, yeah, they're very conventionalised, and at the bottom very non, but I'm not sure that this is exactly in order of most to least, but roughly. So in English you have, now it's a little bit hard for people to understand the use. So in the past you might have heard of idioms, meaning only things like it's raining cats and dogs, for example. But some linguists use the term idioms to mean structures, various sort of structures. So for example, it takes one to know one. That's an expression in English. You can't say it takes him to know one. You can only say it takes one to know one. So that expression has to be exactly that. You can't change anything. So that's more conventional. But then there are other types of these kinds of idioms. For example, someone blew their nose. I could say I blew my nose. Or you can say he blew his nose. So X blew X's nose. You can change the X and put different people in there. So it's not completely fixed. There is some sort of flexibility in that. Also, we have like intonation, your voice intonation. So if you're asking a yes, no question, you usually go up. You going to the shops now? Are you going to the shops now? Or do you like that? So you can hear the voice goes up in English, and actually in Auslan, the eyebrows usually go up at the same time. So those are also less fixed. There's some sort of flexibility, but they're still fairly conventional. Then you have very abstract structures or constructions, they're called. So like X verbed Y. That could be anything for X or anything for the Y, and not any verb. It actually has to be particular verbs that will take except X and Y. So for example, the boy pushed the girl, or I kicked my toe, or I can never think of examples at the time that I want. So maybe the woman gave the lecture in English. It's one sign in Auslan, give a lecture. So that's a lot more general. You can change a lot of things about that pattern. We also have things like pointing in English, where, sorry, I've jumped ahead one slide, but anyway, basically face-to-face communication uses a lot of gesture. People don't realise how much they gesture. So we're not talking about written language, we're talking about using communication face-to-face or through the air. So it really means like one-on-one, communicating with each other in the here and now. You use a lot of pointing. It doesn't have to be with that finger, it could be like this or like that, or that. There's a lot of things that happen, and they're all types of points because you are somehow trying to direct someone's attention to a different place. And that's very flexible in form. So it's a lot less conventionalised than things further up. You've also got things like eye gaze, facial expressions included in meaning, and also some gesticulations or gestures. So I don't mean symbolic gestures like good, bad, but something like, oh, it was huge, or wow. Like, did you see that? Or it's actually really hard to do this, speak about this in sign language. But if you watch, I recently saw a clip from the Dalai Lama. Oh, I spelt that wrongly. A great clip I saw from the Dalai Lama, and he was speaking a different language, but you could almost sort of see what he's signing because of his gesticulations and his gesturing. So that is also a lot less conventional, but it's still one of the things you can use, an option, a resource you can use to give a message in English. You know, I have like notes over here, so if you see me looking down there, it's because I can't remember, so I haven't got a laptop in front of me. Sign languages are very different to spoken languages. There are some things about their nature that's very different. Now, one of the things is they don't have a written form that people use. So you're always communicating face to face or through the air. So it's also called oral communication. That means also you can only communicate through the air, plus communication has to be with eye contact. You'd never sign like on a phone where you're not looking at each other. Like even if you're on a phone, like a Skype call or something, you still make eye contact. So you're sort of sharing the space around. You never communicate out of context. Actually, this is an example where I am. Like I'm giving this lecture and it's actually very hard. It's interesting because, you know, I'm communicating here out of context in sign, and that's really, this is the first time I've done this. I've interpreted before to a camera. I've interpreted in front of a camera before for online courses or things, or I've taught courses in sign, but face to face. But I've realised that some things, like the fact that I've got notes down there and I've got to tell you why I'm looking down there, it's a little bit difficult to control because I don't have that eye contact with people. So anyway, sign languages need eye contact. When people use sign languages, they always have eye contact. It's not always a clear difference between what is linguistic and what's not. So sign language uses space around. So for example, in spoken languages, if you said it was over there and you used a point, it'd be really clear. The spoken part is language and the point is gesture. But in sign languages, it's not clear. Like, where was the man standing over there? So is that language or is that a point? Like, it's less clear. The boundaries between language and non-linguistic things is less clear. The deaf community exists, or deaf communities, like whether they're using ASL or BSL, New Zealand Sign Language, deaf communities exist in a very strongly embedded in a hearing world. So they have a lot of influence from the spoken language. And it's bilingual, but it's not balanced. English is a lot more dominant and influences Auslan a lot more than Auslan influences English. And finally, there are many, many, many people using sign language who are delayed because they weren't able to acquire language at the right time. They learned it late. So we'll talk a little bit further about that later. And that means the situation with people using sign language is very different to many spoken languages. But it's actually a lot more similar to other minority languages, like some Aboriginal languages. So remember again, these are the resources that you use in English. Now, what about in Auslan? So I'm going to go through each of these resources in Auslan, starting with the first one, which is fully lexical signs. That means that sign, you can pick up a dictionary and the sign is right there. You can find it exactly like that, like sister or car or, you know, film camera or take a photo or, can't think of an example, 6. So those signs don't really change at all. Run and walk and other examples. So if you sign that sign, people understand it. You don't need to give any context or any extra information. It can be any noun or adjective or verb. Well, actually, no, hang on. Most of the time, if it's a verb, there has to be some sort of link to the body. Like run, you can't move the sign. So it'll be a little bit clearer when I move on. So I know some of you know nothing about this and some of you already know this, and so I'm trying to be brief and I can answer more questions if on the discussion board, or, you know, you can also read Johnston and Shembry's book. Anyway, so it's up to you. So it's something, I'll try to remember to put some links up to some good videos that explain things as well. So next we have partly lexical signs. That means you have it in the dictionary, yes, but you have the citation form. So for example, in English, you'll have the word in the dictionary like walk. You'd find walk in the dictionary, but you're not going to find walks or walked or walking or any of these in the dictionary. There'll just be one, and that's the citation form. Similarly, in partly lexical signs, you'll have something in the dictionary like, for example, look. You'll see look in the dictionary. But you won't see look at me, look at each other, look around the room. So basically, in partly lexical signs, at least one part of the sign changes, and usually it's the direction. There are three sort of types of partly lexical signs: indicating verbs, which move or change direction to show who, like I looked at you, you looked at me, we looked around, I gave everything, or they each gave them to me. Other examples like taking from there or taking from there. So you can change the verb to show who and what. And I'm not saying subject or object, because actually there's evidence that it really doesn't match those roles, grammatical roles. So linguists prefer to talk about actor or undergoer. There's also points, they're partly lexical. So pointing can change direction to add meaning, like pointing to me or you or the two of them, or his or her over there, or ours, or all of theirs. Okay, so you'll find, yours or theirs in the dictionary, but you can also modify those in some ways, so that makes them less conventional and fixed. And lastly, there's something called depicting signs for a partly lexical sign. If you have a look at the next slide. Depicting signs or verbs, they show or depict something. So the hand shape, it's more iconic, so it looks like the thing it's talking about. So for example, this hand shape could be cup. But it is flexible. So for example, maybe tree. You could talk about a tree with these hand shapes, or this, or even that. So it really depends on what you're trying to say. You don't have to use one hand shape. The movement and location changes depending on the context. When you use a depicting sign, without the context, you can't understand it. Like if you just see straight this sign, it could be a car hit a pole, or it could be a bus crashed with a person, or there's lots of different things it could mean. You need the context to understand that type of sign. When most people first see that, they think, oh, it's just gesture. Well, it is similar, and it probably came from gesture, but it's actually very immersed in the language. So researchers have found, so Adam Shembry and his other researchers with him, they looked at hearing people. They were looking at little video clips, the hearing people. They'd watch them, and then they were told to please gesture. Don't use your voice, but show me what happened without your voice. And they did the same with deaf signers. And the deaf people, the movement and location, very similar to the hearing people. The deaf people's was probably a little bit more similar to each other. There was more variation with the hearing, but not a lot. But the deaf people with their hand shape, each just had one or two hand shapes for each thing. There wasn't a lot of variation. It was very conventionalised. But the hearing people had lots and lots of different hand shapes. They had no conventions. So for a plane flying, the deaf would all use one hand shape, but the hearing would do all these different ways. And the deaf just had this one sort of conventionalised way. So the hand shape is normally like a category of things. There are three types of depicting signs. You have, have a look up there. So the three types of depicting signs. You have entity depicting signs, and that's where your hand shape is the thing or an object. So you're showing movement or location with your hand as if it's an object. So a person walking forward, or you can also show relative location, like something behind something that's placed there. Secondly, there is handling depicting signs, and that shows how a person does something with an object. So for example, moving something or picking something up. They're acting on an object. So it could be like, I don't know, picking up something big, picking up something small. And lastly, there's what's called size and shape specifiers, or SASs, and that's like adjectives, descriptives. talking about the surface or something. Your handshake isn't a thing, and it's not how a person holds a thing, but it's sort of showing hands tracing an object. Tracing so you can see what that object would look like or would feel like. Auslan also has other ways that it can modify verbs. So for example, adverbs. You can sign things like confident or careful or slow, but very often people don't use the sign, they actually use facial expression changes or non-manual feature changes. So for example, I'm writing really slowly. They actually show what's happening. Or like fixing something, or I'm really fixing it, taking a lot of care with that. So you can show with your facial expression change. So intensity, it really just means very. Auslan has a sign very, but people, if you see someone sounding very, very slow or very, very good, or, it's very English, and deaf people don't use that a lot. So I don't know when deaf people do it. I know they do it, but a lot less common than hearing people like me doing it. So they usually show the intensity of a verb or an adjective. They show that intensity by changing the movement. So for example, we've got red, or for very red, you would sign it like that. So there's like a hold and then a release of movement. Or another example might be, let's see, maybe work or work really hard would be like this. Black or black, it was so black. It was so fast. There's a hold and then a release of the movement to show the meaning of very. Like fast just means really, really fast. Very, very fast. So constructed action, which is sometimes called role shift, it's actually very hard to explain in just a few sentences. It's where it's a little bit like imitation of another person or thing. So it's very subtle. Could just be an eye gaze change. You change how you refer. So if the person says I, they actually mean I, this thing I'm pretending to be. You can shift the body, but it doesn't usually happen, or not always. And what's the other? Oh yeah, facial expression changes as well. So for example, I might say, oh, what are you doing that for? Oh, sorry. See the way I look down? Someone was looking down and then someone else was looking up. When that happens, and then people look back to the sort of audience, that means it's a neutral voice or narrator's voice, as opposed to I was being someone else. So that is really a really fast sort of structure of Auslan in 2 minutes. It's not in depth, but why I think it's important for you to know, well, there's a few reasons. It's important for people who don't sign to realise that sign language is very rich and complex, and researchers wouldn't spend all their time doing it if there was nothing there. It's a very rich language and complex, and if you only look at the actual signs and forget all of the grammar and facial expressions and space, it looks like, oh, you've just left off all the English words. A lot of people say that. It's like, no, we're not leaving off the English words. What you do is you express those concepts through other ways. So often you change your facial expression, or you might body posture, or the way you sign, the stress of a sign. So it's important for people who don't sign to understand that. Also, it's important for people that can sign but aren't really great to realise that they miss a lot of information, and I'm including myself in this. There are times I've evaluated a child and I think, oh, I know them well, and then a deaf person will come in and say, oh, they just signed this, and I'll think, oh my gosh, they're right, and I really missed that. And I can miss that. I'm not talking about like if I've been researching it or watching it over and over, but if I'm just watching something very quickly, it's easy for me as a hearing person who didn't grow up signing, it's easy to miss things. And it's really important to realise that there can be a lot of rich meaning in there that can be very subtly expressed, and hearing people, or people who don't sign well rather, can miss that. Deaf children who sign Most of you probably know this, but 95 to 99% of them are born into hearing families. And those families don't sign typically. So for students who use Auslan, the risk of delay is quite huge. So some of that is because parents are still told misinformation about signing with the child. It will hurt their speech and you shouldn't do it. And sometimes really it's overt, they straight out say it, but oftentimes it's not actually willful. It's like people use expressions like, oh, they won't need sign. And what they mean by need is that's bad. We try not to do that. It'll only be a last resort. They're not trying to say, oh, it's bad, but really what they're saying with that verb need sign, actually there's a lot of information in that, and that impacts on parents. They get a lot of things like that, a lot of negative messages that can be quite subtle, not intentional, but a lot of these expressions actually change their mind, and it makes people go, oh, no, I don't want to have sign language, until it's very late and they go, oh, it's not working. Okay, now we'll move them into a signing program. So children in signing programs, many of them arrive after they're already incredibly delayed. If they were in a mainstream or mainstream or oral program and they were going well, then it shouldn't be this way, but the reality is they're not going to actually come to us. They come to us when it isn't working out there. So they arrive already with a very significant delay. Most of the time, even the families that choose sign, for different reasons, just don't actually learn to sign themselves. It could be personal reasons with their family or their time or access to classes or whatever. So when the family, even when they really try to learn Auslan, then there's still a lot of time at home that the children are missing sign, a lot of communication they miss out on. So they arrive at our program already behind, and then we have maybe 30 hours a week at school with them, and then the rest of the time they have very little access to language. So we have to catch up a lot faster than 1 year per 1 year. We've got less than a year's access and we have to make more than a year's progress. So for our kids, for signing deaf kids, ours in our school, for signing deaf children, you're really starting already with a bigger problem. For our refugee children, it can be worse because often they don't have access to hearing aids or cochlear implants. Or one of my students, for example, she had an implant, a refugee child, but there was absolutely no habilitation. The family didn't know that they gave her an implant and they said, whoop, that's it. And then she had no access to any therapy or habilitation. So many of our children, most of our refugee children, haven't actually even been to school before. Some of them, but most often they actually arrive at us, sort of 8 or 9 or 10, and they've never actually been to school or had any language of any kind. So access to sign language outside is a big problem, and them arriving late. So there's an even bigger chance that our kids, signing kids, are going to be language delayed, and we really need, therefore, to focus on their language and really help them with their language. This means it's even more important than for other kids that we collect data, assessment data, on those kids to see if they're developing and to evaluate ourselves. Is our program having an effect on them? Do we need to change how we're teaching? It's really important for oral children and ESL children as well. But those kids at least have access to a lot of different types of assessments that are really good, and they're well standardised and designed and published and standardised. So in the Auslan situation, unfortunately, is not that great, or in all sign languages, rather. So assessments must include the collection of good quality and quantity of data to make a valid judgment. And it has to be done, or the data has to be collected in a reliable way, but it has to be practical. Nobody's got time for 100 hours for each student for each term to collect some language sample and analyse it in depth. It has to be practical, and it has to give teachers like us useful information. I want to know, what can my child do now? what do I teach them next? Now we come to the issue of assessment tools. So before we think about why can't we just make one? Well, I can tell you from experience, I've been making one for the last few years. It is not an easy task. There are a lot of issues anyway. So iconicity is one issue. The other issue is the low numbers of deaf kids. We've got the issue of how we're going to record when there's no written form of the language. And what about lexical variation? That's a big issue. And finally, who is competent enough to be assessing the child? So I'm going to go through each of those. So iconicity. So many signs, especially ones young children learn, can look like the thing they're talking about, the referent. So for example, ball or cup, maybe car. Other signs don't, like mum or sister, or pen, although pen does a little bit, I think maybe pencil. But is it an exact match, like you can just tell what it means? No, but it gives some hint of the shape. So I just want to talk about iconicity briefly. If you have a look at this slide, you'll see tree, there's lots of different types of trees. And then there are lots of features of trees. How it feels, how it looks, the colour. And then people pick out, a dominant feature. So for example, you might think of it's the bushiness at the top, or you might think of the branching sort of shape. And then deaf, not like, intentionally make it up, but when it's sort of first created, they will match some sort of dominant feature. So in ASL, they're obviously focusing on the branching shape with that sign. In Auslan, the sign focuses on the bushy top because that's the sign. So both of those are iconic. They're both iconic signs, but they're both completely different. You can see though how they link with the referent, but it's not the same. They've each chosen a different way of signing it. So how do we make sure that the assessment, the children are not just guessing? Like if the children are asked to pick one, for example, tree, one way to get around this is have another picture which also could be iconic. So for example, a cloud looks like the sign tree. So if you didn't know, you could think, oh, they're signing cloud, if you didn't actually know the sign, because it looks a bit similar. And another solution is to make sure that the picture you choose for the referent looks different to the sign. So in Auslan, the sign is tree like this, the bushy top. So don't choose a tree like that, choose a tree with like a pine tree, or something with like big leaves out of the top like this palm tree. It won't completely fix the issue of iconicity, but they're two strategies you use in the design of sign language assessment tools to try to solve that issue. Now we come to the issue of the low numbers of deaf students or deaf people. So to assess, to make assessment tools, we need to get enough information about what sort of the normal curve is of development. And for many years, really, this has been the biggest issue, and technology sort of wasn't around to do research on the language very well. So before about the 60s or 70s overseas, and a bit more recently in Australia, like we've started to actually, there was no research on Auslan, and there's started to be a lot more research now on Auslan grammar. And there are many things we thought before that we've realised, oh, it's not actually so. We don't have all of the grammar described, and we certainly have very little research on the acquisition of Auslan, and how children should be acquiring this or that or the other. So you've often heard, or we've often read that, people do this or children do that. And if you say, well, where's that information from? They'll say, oh, it's in an overseas tool, but we don't actually know that. They haven't actually done the research. So that's been a big issue. Internationally, there's been some research, but it's usually very small numbers, maybe 2 or 3 children. Studies of the acquisition of research, they'll have 100, 200, 300 kids, and we've got like 2 or 3. Maybe that's the right age they do that. Maybe they're very advanced, maybe they're very delayed. We really don't know. There's not enough information. But the reason why is that there's just not enough deaf children. Australia is also very large, so they're spread out. So when you make an assessment tool, you want to collect norms, and there simply aren't enough kids for that. To film and assess all deaf kids from all deaf families, maximum you get is maybe 40 or 50 in the whole country of that age range. So it's certainly not 1,000 like you might get in some spoken language assessment norms. 1,000 children, we just don't have it. We don't have that as an option. So that's a really big problem with designing assessment tools to give us norms. And if you remember norms, I've put that little picture in to remind you of what norms mean. The next issue is how are you going to write responses? So if it's a receptive test, the child just presses buttons or you choose an option and that's fine. But if it's expressive, how can you write the actual responses of a child? And when people write the responses, you know, there's a lot of information that can get missed, like with facial expression or directions. If you just write the actual manual signs, it looks like it doesn't look like a great language sample, but it's because you're actually missing a lot of the information. And if you want to include all of that information, it is an incredibly slow process to transcribe it. Luckily, recently, over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, there's been a great advance of software, things like ELAN, which is called the UDICO or European, I can't remember the name, but it's from MPI, the Max Planck Institute. Is that how you spell it? Planck? I can't remember. So Institute, and in the Netherlands, and that is an excellent tool, ELAN. There's maybe 2 or 3 people working full time just on that, and it's free. And if you have any problems, you can email them, they answer, they update it frequently, so people make suggestions. It's an excellent tool for sign language research and gesture research. You have basically the video playing, a child or whatever video, and then you have codes that you can link to that place in the video at the time. So if you wanted to look up, for example, every time the child has signed go or went or any type of, say you say go to all different directions, you can look for that and you get a list of all those times, and if you click on it, it takes you straight to that part of the video. So it's fantastic. It can search through video for particular signs. But it's still a big issue is how you record the actual language and write it down, and that's made it hard. The fourth issue is issues with lexical variation. So very often sign languages have quite high rates of variation. It's possibly because there's no written form, and also that until quite recently, with better technology, people would sort of communicate mainly with people in their little local community. Now there's plenty of Skyping or sort of chatting online, but before there wasn't that type of thing. Also, the first school in Australia was set up by a guy in Scotland. He didn't go to. Another man from England set up a school in Melbourne. And the sign languages were very similar, but not exactly the same. So that sort of started a southern or northern dialect, it was often called. And really, it's very mixed these days. Sydney is not all southern or all northern. It's got some signs that were considered southern and some from the north. It's very mixed, and that's a problem with an assessment tool. So if you know the child, I need to know, does a child understand me? It's not that they don't understand that one sign, it's that they're actually understanding or not understanding the expression or whatever I'm assessing. The fifth and last issue I'm talking about, issue with the tools, is what about the skills of the assessor? It would be great if each school had a really fluent assessor who could sign well, and the schools gave them time to do the analysis and transcribe it, but the reality is that's not happening. So language samples are problematic. Also, the actual assessment tool that we do have, you have to be accredited to use it. And there's simply not enough accredited people. And that means you need an assessment tool that can be scored with people who don't have great signing skills. And also schools should be giving time for people to do these sort of transcriptions, etc. You can't simply take an assessment tool, that's from a spoken language and just translate it into a sign language. Basically, the main issue is the grammar is not the same. The word order is not the same. So if you get some particular word, it's not going to be used the same way. Like, for example, the sign very, which I talked about. Yeah, there is a sign very, but it's not used the same way. Very often it's facial expression that will show the very. And so I'm going to show you two examples that people often use when they're trying to assess signing children, and it just doesn't translate well. So the first example is MLU, mean length of utterance. MLU is very hard in sign language because what is a morpheme is not clear. For example, if I did really read like this, is that two morphemes? Because the intensity is included. Maybe you decide, okay, well that will be one or that will be two, but the issue is everybody's not making those same decisions, so you can't really compare it. Plus linguists themselves sometimes, they spend all day researching the language and they can't agree what counts as a morpheme in sign languages. So how is some teacher going to know? Also, how many morphemes is normal to have at 2 or 3 or 4 in sign language? We know in English, yes, but in sign languages we don't know that information. So it's really hard to compare. Is that the right level they should be? And one way around this could be to count how many signs they're actually using in a particular time, and then to, like, you've got a couple of options. You could say, okay, well, I'm going to look at it there. There's, 10 there, and later there was a bit more, and I've seen an increase. So, it shows developed, but it's not normed, or it's not really comparable with what should be happening at that age. So MLU is really not a great way of measuring language for signing children. Also, actual adults in sign languages, research has shown that they have shorter clauses than utterances, or rather sort of clauses, than spoken languages. So the clause is a little bit shorter, and that means that what is normal for an adult will not be the same as what is the normal rate for spoken languages. And my experience is people tend to underestimate and say that the child has less morphemes per utterance, and that's a real risk when you're using MLU. You're really catching all of the units of meaning that the child is using, and if you're not, that means that you might compare with spoken language and say, oh, they're not as good, but maybe it's actually that you're missing a lot of those units of meaning. The next area that I'm going to look at, example of an issue, is spatial terms, like, for example, in or on. People feel like, oh, well, in and on, they're actual a thing, it's a concept. So everyone would have in and on. But actually, English has decided that this meaning is in and these meanings are on. Other languages will describe the same thing a different way. So for example, in English you say the door handle is on the door, or an apple is on the table. But if there's a bowl with an apple inside it, you'd say in. The apple is in the bowl. In Spanish, it's one word, en. En for the handle on the door, en for the apple on the table, or en for the apple in the bowl. It's the same, en, one word. In Dutch, there's a different word for on vertical surface compared to on a horizontal surface, and different again for containment. So really it's 3 different words. So different languages break up these concepts in very different ways. Sign languages also are very different. Sign languages also have the spatial signs like in or on, but they're not used a lot of the time. Most of the time when people talk about location or movement, they're using depicting signs, which I talked about before. So they show where. You can sign in, but it is much more common to do this. Bowl, apple in. Plus, when you're doing it this way, it's actually quite complex cognitively. So children who are learning how to show relative location, they don't get complete mastery until about 9 or 10 in Auslan. This is one area we actually do have research. So my PhD was looking at this, and I had 27 native signers from about 4 to 10. I tried 3, but failed. So about 4 years old to 10 years old. And 1 year later I came back and filmed them all again, and you could actually, I was looking at how they showed space, and they were still not fully adult-like until 10 or more. So it's not really a great area to be looking at, to focus on that with young children. You know, it's not that they can't do in or on, but other terms like left and right and things that are relative location or mental rotation, it's more complex than in spoken languages. You know, they might pick up concepts like in or on early, but some ones that require a change in perspective, mental rotation, are a lot harder and develop a lot later. So if you were just to compare with English, you might say, the English in the Auslan child, you might say, oh, it looks like the Auslan child's delayed, but it's not really, it's that it's cognitively more complex. So if you have a look at this now, we're going to talk about the assessment tools that we do have at the moment in Auslan. So you talked before in other lectures about what assessment's for. What are the purposes of assessment? And I've put that list here to remind you. And also, I think last year or 2 years ago, as part of my research project, I made as part of my research project making an assessment tool, I asked a lot of teachers of the deaf who work with signing children around Australia, I asked them, what do they need in an assessment tool? What do they use assessment tools for, etc. And I got about 30 teachers responding, and they had a few other suggestions which I thought were quite interesting about why they use assessment tools that I hadn't thought of before. So I thought I'd add those extras here. This is all of their responses. So maybe, yes, you want to know if they can access the curriculum. Like, are they not understanding the maths, or are they just they don't have enough sign to be able to? You also want to be able to match an interpreter with a child. So that child's more English-like, that child's more Auslan-like, to try and match which interpreter. And also, this is a little bit similar, you have to check if the child really is an Auslan signer or a keyword signer. And keyword signing really means you're speaking English and you've just got some signs with it. So they were some suggestions teachers of the deaf around Australia had for why they use Auslan assessment tools. So if you want to collect data from kids, we talked before, you talked before with Melissa and Greg, you can use, one of the easiest things to score is fixed choice tests. For example, you've just got 4 options, A, B, C or D, or matching one thing to another. They're very easy for the teacher to score, but they actually are very hard to design well, to think of the ideas and design it well to make it. You can also have more open questions, but you can still have, you know, a certain number of answers they might say rather than it being completely open. Or the most realistic language is, it's very hard to score, but very easy to make, and that's collecting a language sample, for example, from Signing Child. It doesn't cost a lot to prep for it, but the scoring is really hard because you need to know what you're doing it for and transcribe it, and it takes a long time in sign language. I've started to tell you a little bit about the assessment tools we do have, and I want to start with 0 to 3-year-olds because in Australia, there's a very well designed, in the UK, there's a UK early support monitoring protocols. We're used to saying the BSL monitoring protocols because that's what we use it for normally. So why that is a good tool, I think Melissa shared this with you guys actually, but it has spoken English and sign language together, and it also includes other areas of development for the young children. So the psych development, their physical development, all of these areas are related. So I think, you know, it's a very good tool for that reason. It's used a lot around Australia and it's very valuable, and it's free. So it sort of covers 5 areas. You've got communication, paying attention or attending, social and emotional development, playing, and sort of some other developmental milestones. And the communication you can have either in BSL or in speech, or both. and they also provide information strategies for how to extend their language. Next, there's the MacArthur Developmental Inventories, sometimes called the CDI. They have an English version, but they also have an ASL version and a BSL version. Here, this is a parental checklist, and I used to be quite arrogant with a linguist, and as a linguist, and say, "Oh, really? A parent's going to get everything or miss?" But there's a lot of research to show that the parents are actually very reliable in collecting. They really do know what their child can and can't do, whether they know a sign or not. However, in sign language, it's also a good idea that if a person working with the child and the family, if the family don't sign well, it's good for them both to work together, or to each do their own but then compare them. But in general, parental reports are quite accurate. The BSL version, I think you can find it on the internet, I'm not sure, but I don't think it's published. But it's from, so I think it's, so the spoken language one is from 0 to 2.5, and then 2.5 to 4, or something like that, 2 versions. But the BSL one, there's just one. And there's a few connected signs, but mostly it's individual words, individual signs on their own. So the next assessment tool is the visual communication skills, and hang on, the visual VCSL, visual communication and sign language checklist. The researchers got together a whole lot of other people's checklists and merged them together into one checklist. And also, look, it's really not clear from the manual how they decided what ages children can or can't do things, but I believe they actually did some research, but it's really not clear where the data is from. But it's a good standardised checklist. It's a good place to start, so it's good to know about. It's an assessment tool from the US, but I think it's quite valuable. You definitely need to have the person doing the checklist has to be skilled at sign language to be able to recognise the things. I don't think it tells you what's the next thing to teach, but it does at least give you some goals for each sort of age group, so that's good. Next, there's the Rossetti, which is for spoken language development from 0 to 3. But it really would require very few changes to be suitable for sign language assessment, because it's not focused on form, it's more on sort of communication skills. So it wouldn't matter if it's sign or spoken language. For example, does the child get attention? Are they able to get attention, or can they ask for help? It doesn't say you have to say, can I have? It's quite easy to sort of translate. It's quite functional. What can the child do with language? And I actually think this would be a really good tool to use with sign language children. I haven't actually used it because I don't work with 0 to 3-year-olds, but from looking at the tool, I think it looks really good, like a really good match in the future. I'd like to translate it. So really, at the moment, for young children, I think using one of these 3 is the best, either the UK protocols, the VCSL, or the Rossetti. I think they're great tools. There's also different versions of a checklist that I've used for many years teaching, a checklist in Auslan development, and it's sort of filtered out, and other people have made different versions and used in their program, but I don't think it's comprehensive enough. And I think these 3 are the best tools to be using at the moment. So leaving aside younger children and moving up to standardised assessment for school-aged children, there is the BSL, receptive and expressive test, which has been translated into Auslan. There's also a really fantastic tool from the Netherlands, an assessment tool, but unfortunately it's not translated. And it's also really old technology. The developer's updating it soon, but there's also a good German assessment. So the big one that's relevant to all of you, and you might have seen reports from, is the BSL receptive skills test and the BSL narrative production test. There's a link there you can click on and have a look at parts of the test. VDEI have published the It was the first published and standardised sign language assessment tool in the world, and the first test to be normed and tested for reliability. It assesses the comprehension of BSL from 3 to 13 years of age. Any skilled, fluent user of sign is able to use it. Really, the sign language receptive skills test, you don't actually sign with the child a lot. They actually have a video, like an old-fashioned video cassette, and they look at someone signing on the screen, and then they answer. But why they say you should be, a NAATI level 2 interpreter, basically, what used to be called, it's because this test is paired with the narrative skills production test, and for that test you need to be skilled. If you're not a skilled signer, you shouldn't be using the assessment. So that's why they say it for this one. The assessment is really good in that it includes a vocab check. There are 22 signs that are used, and they want to know that the children know what those signs are, so they check them all. If they don't know, you tell the child, because they don't want the child to be watching the receptive skills test, not answer, but we don't know if they don't actually understand the structure or just that one noun or verb or something. So from that, they say they're either using northern or southern dialect. For us, the issue is, certainly in our school, we are half southern, half northern. So that's a bit of a problem. So the child watches the video, and then there's 4 pictures, 3 or 4 pictures. I think sometimes there's 3. And then they watch, the child picks which one, and then the assessor writes down their answer. An example of some pictures are here. I think the sign is something like this. And I think it's the car behind the house. The child sort of looks at it and then picks. When the scoring's finished, it takes maybe about 30 minutes to go through, maybe 40 questions. Hang on, is that right? Yeah. So maybe 30 minutes to get through the 40 questions, I think, 30 to 40 minutes. Then the scoring, it's simply, are they right or wrong? And then on the front of the page, you can transfer which ones they were right or wrong. And it'll say, these are the questions about that area of grammar or that area of grammar to match it up. So you can work out which areas are weak or strong for the child. But really some areas I've only got, for example, 3 questions. Or other areas, how they've decided how they've decided, like, for example, what's an entity depicting sign is not the same way we describe it in Australia. So it doesn't completely match the way we would be looking at depicting signs, for example. So it's still a good way to start to give you ideas on which areas you can work on with the child. But what it doesn't do, unfortunately, is tell you, okay, I know I need to work on, for example, negatives, using like no, not, whatever, don't want. But what do they get first? What do they do next? Like, how do I set goals to get them up to adult level? But it will tell you the area. When they finished that test, making the test, a few years later, the same people got together and a couple of others and made the narrative production test. So they have a video, and the child watches the video, and in retelling the story, they know they're going to cover depicting signs, indicating verbs. It's designed that way. And then they filmed however many children, and then wrote the score sheet based on what the children sort of most often would say. So the assessment scores narrative content, meaning, what happened in the story, did they include all the information? Narrative structure, because it's a retell, so they're looking at the video and then retelling the story. So do they have an orientation? Do they have sort of the middle events? Do they have a conclusion, etc.? And sequencing. And they also score various areas of grammar. Do they use depicting signs right? And all sorts of other areas. So it's very complex to score. And to do that, you need to go to a course for 2 or 3 days. And then you go back and assess a child, pass it, and see if you can be passed to be able to use that assessment tool. So it's a great assessment, but unfortunately not many teachers are able to. Oh, and also the course, when you do the training, there are no interpreters provided. They say if you can't understand enough to be able to do the course, you really shouldn't be using this assessment tool. So now we have the Auslan, assessing Auslan development. So it's a great assessment in that it gives you norms, and it's a reliable way to collect data. So our school uses that every 2 years, in a way, as a way to collect a narrative sample. And you can see the same kids, what they did each sort of 2 years. So some of our kids, this will be their 4th or 5th time they've retold it this year. And it's great to be able to see their development telling the same story. On the other years, we have a different, on the odd years we use this. It's called Spider Story, we call it for short, because the story in the assessment tool, the film, is about a spider. So we use Spider Story on odd years, and then in the even years we use a different book to collect a narrative from the child. So there are some issues with this assessment, not because it was badly designed, but because the simple fact is there are not enough children to collect norms that I talked about before. The population of kids is really small. So the norms are quite vague. For example, you don't say like the 1st or 2nd or 3rd percentile, it's like 0 to the 25th percentile, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, or 75 to 90. So 90th percentile. So it's very, it's kind of rough. It just gives you a rough percentile. And also it doesn't tell you, what do I work on next? I can see if they've scored well or not scored well, but it's hard to know for setting goals, what do I do next? And you need someone very fluent in the language and who's had training. Another assessment which is really worthwhile looking at, I'm including the slides because I want you to have a look at them, and it's got links for you to click on, but I'm not going to go through them all in detail. So if you have a little look at those, for example, the BSL vocab test is really good. I really like that one. I'd like to translate that into Auslan next. So also have a look at these. So in the absence of, any other assessment tools right now, or someone who's qualified to use it, what should you be using? I would say the first thing is, if you have any fluent signers at your school, it doesn't matter if they're a T-Trade, really, or if it's not the responsibility, let them have a look at the child's signing. They'll give you an indication, are there issues with their signing or not? Use checklists, but maybe the early childhood ones, so the VCSL that we talked about before, that really is, it's aimed at 0 to whatever it is, 3 or whatever. But if they arrive at age 8 with nothing, well, then that's a great one to start using. If you don't know, we don't know when kids arrive late, will they go through the same developmental path? We don't know. We don't have any information on that, but we might as well start with that. It's a good way to start collecting data. Maybe they'll match, maybe not. So now I want to talk about the solution longer term, or a solution. So 2 or 3 years ago, I started, actually it's 3 years ago, good grief, working on an assessment tool for Auslan to complement the VDEI tool. I am not replacing it. Some people have said like, oh, it's replaced. No, it's to complement with the goals that you don't need a fluent signing teacher, because the fact of the matter is many schools don't have that. And we still want them to have assessment data. I wanted it designed and developmentally, like sequentially, so that people can know, if you can do that, what is next? What do we work on? I wanted it to cover lots of different areas, be very comprehensive. So yes, I want to chunk on depicting signs, and a chunk on this, and a chunk on that, and a lot of information on each area. So yeah, very comprehensive. But also I wanted to match spoken language assessments as much as possible. So spoken language assessments often look at the acquisition of language processing, such as categorizing or describing. I wanted to include things like that. Also, I wanted to include being able to use, I also wanted it to be a tool that you could follow and track their development. Plus, we really need a way to collect data and information long-term to collect norms, because we don't have enough numbers at once. So I thought, well, if I'm using the internet, it's a good way to collect that information. Maybe in 5 years or 10 years, I can start to say you should be able to do that by 5 or by whatever. We don't know yet. For now, it'll simply say they can do this, next do this. But later, I hope to be able to say, to improve and add on when they should be able to do something. So I decided to use technology, the internet, obviously, to have fixed choice assessment, make it a fixed choice assessment. That means the child goes back and forth between receptive and expressive for each question. when it's comprehension, the child just simply picks one picture. When it's expressive, the teacher has to pick one of 4 options. Did the child sign this, this, or other? So it means the score time, it's just automatic. So the data is less natural and it's harder to make, but the scoring is much easier. I'm assessing and eliciting really specific structures. So in the project, one of the big things I did, before I used to use a checklist for many years for children, I went back and I thought, okay, I read again everything, all of the literature that I could find about the acquisition of sign language, as long as they had at least 3 kids in the study who were native signers. There are other papers which I read and they're great, and it doesn't mean they're not worth it. Absolutely not. But what I'm trying to do is find out, what do native signing kids do? If I'm looking at what the norm is, I don't want to aim for a child who's already, delayed. I'm trying to aim for what would happen, I want to know what the norm is so we can then say, if they're not up to there. Also, I realised when I was including all of these things, it is going to make the assessment really huge, 400, 500 questions. So the first time through is just going to take forever in the pilot, but then we will be taking half of the questions off. That is just normal. You lose about half of the questions when you do the analysis of the questions after a pilot. So half of them won't be kicked off. And if they're not, I will be throwing out half the questions. So I looked at all these different areas of grammar, and I looked at what age native signers, or like what they can do at particular ages. So along the top I had columns for, every age. It could be every 6 months, every 1 year. And I looked at that across the top, and it would make a huge Excel chart. And for everything, every cell, it says, everything I've claimed, it says who says it, and you go to another tab in the Excel chart, and you can say the name of the paper. I'm not just making this up. This is the paper. This is how this person looked at 24 kids, age whatever to whatever, and I've given information about what that person did, what they found. So you can go and look at every single paper and check any of it. And it's important because there's a lot of information out there. Oh, child's going to do this. And I'm like, who says? Who says? Where's that from? So I want to make sure it's clear where every claim is made. So this is an example of a couple of little sort of cells. So depicting signs, entity depicting signs. At a particular age, this is what they can do in general or in hand shape, expressive. So this is just an example of the types of information in the chart. Then I took all of those columns and I just broke it up into 5 developmental stages. It's completely arbitrary. It's just 5 because. So children do this, then they do this, then they do this, then they do this. So they are arbitrary stages, these columns, and it means level 1 of depicting signs doesn't necessarily happen at the same time as level 1 for, directional verbs or whatever. So there are just 5 stages for each area of grammar. So there's an example up here of what I did. I then looked at, for example, the child may first use, understand manipulation with their, hand shapes, one-handed hand shapes for handling signs, manipulation. So here's what they can do. That's great. If they can, then you go to the next part. If they can't, then that's still the goal. So what I'm going to do now is go through an example prototype. This is not the actual colours or the design of the assessment tool. It was the first prototype before we actually had the computer programmers working on it. So it looks different, but it's a made-up child, but it just gives you an idea of and it also looks a lot simpler. It's usually a lot more complex than that, but I've just chosen a couple of examples. I don't actually know how it's going to look, but the teachers are going to get something like this. So you can see that where the child's up to receptively and where they're up to expressively for that sort of grammatical area. Then, and here's an example here. And it'll be written in a lot more simple language. At the moment, it's not being written simplified, but it'll be something like, can use one-handed shapes for blah, blah. Then I hope, after collecting data for a long time, not at the start, but, after I've collected and can see what people can do at each age, I hope in the future I can say, okay, this and this, they should be able to do that at age 5, for example. So a native signer, if I'm collecting the data from native signers, not filmed data, I can say they should be able to do it at about 5. And then you can say, is the child delayed or not? But the other information I realise we need is, yes, okay, maybe we know they're all delayed. Yes, we know. They've arrived late, they're delayed. What I want to know is, where should they be if they've grown up signing? But also, I want to know, compared to other children who arrived at school late, who started learning language late, how do they compare? So, most of the data will be from late learners as well. It's hard to compare because I know there's such variability in background. Maybe it won't be possible, but I hope to be able to say, for example, at a child who's been learning for 2 years and 2 months, about 90% of kids are going to be from here to here during that time. And this child, you can see, wow, they're actually doing pretty well if considering how long they've been signing, compared to other kids who also have been signing for about 2 years, 2 months. Compared to native signers, no, we're not saying, it's fine, they should be doing that at 5. But they're not doing terribly compared to, for the amount of time they've been in the program. The program's not an issue here, it's simply the fact that they've started signing so late. So I'm still working with computer programmers on software development. I still have to do psychometric testing, evaluations. And that means filming children, so we need to check the children's responses to check that it matches, but I also want to check with the first group, I want to ask different teachers around Australia with different signing levels. I want some who can't sign well, some who sign really well, ask them to film themselves and the child and the scoring, and then I'll be able to compare, did they score correctly? It's not to criticise them, it's to know, is my test design clearly enough that people who can't sign well can do it, and if it's not, then I know, okay, great, I need to change something. And if they are able to score the child accurately, I know it's been made simply enough, that you don't have to be a fluent signer in order to administer the assessment. It's going to be huge help for to be able to show how our kids are developing over time, but it's not going to include how do you teach the next bit, what resources. I hope to work on that later, but first I'm simply doing the assessment tool. Lastly, really, really briefly, because I've really run out of time, I just want to look at goal setting. You've got the assessment, until we've got the assessment, what can you do? How do you make SMART goals, or why? It's really important that we have goals, very specific goals, and also that they're in the right developmental order. It's a problem that's been recognised in immersion programs, not just in sign languages and spoken languages as well. Sometimes the idea is we're just going to shove a whole lot of language into them. We'll just bombard them and immerse them in the language and they're going to pick it up. But you know what? Sometimes you actually need extra. You need to target particular areas. You need to, polish particular skills. So you need specific skills. Not just, I want to improve their Auslan. I want to know, okay, but what? What exactly are you going to do that? Most of the children in our program are delayed. We know that. But there's very few of our kids are actually disordered. Yes, there's some. The same as in hearing schools, there are kids with a language disorder. Most of our children, really, they can progress. We just need to know what are those stages in order to be able to help them the best way. So you need to be able to have goals, but to do that you also need to know, you need to have very targeted situations, not just completely free. Like, for example, setting up contexts. I might set up an activity where I'm saying, can you give me the scissors? I'm asking them to give me the scissors, not give to you, give to me. I might set up an activity where the scissors, there's only one pair of scissors between the both of us. And so I need to ask them, can I have the scissors? Can you give me the scissors? I'm giving them lots of context. They know what I want. So really it's supporting them in that situation to understand what that phrase is. I would do that before I'm giving them less context, like, you know, cards out on the table. Which one? Sorry, not which one. Sorry, can you give me the scissors? Or can you give that person the scissors? Can you give me? Can you give them? Maybe there's two people and I'm saying give me or give them, and they've got to understand enough to know which one. That would come next, and I'm going to do both of those before I'm asking them to express themselves. So you need contextual sort of, more context to less, and definitely comprehension before production. And I've seen a lot of deaf kids arrive at school, and teachers, well, not teachers, teacher aides, lots of people are like, come on, sign this. Just cool it. There's got to be time for them to just take language in and understand before they're going to express things. So we need a sequence of goals that kids can go through. We need resources. And really it's best if we can link it to the content areas we're teaching. In an ideal world, imagine we'd have some, here's the book and here's the language area and here are the areas of, curriculum matches, but we don't have that. We don't. So the next best thing is that we need to share resources with each other. We have to make those activities. It's that simple, ourselves. So I'm sorry this has gone on and on a bit. It's really hard to put a 3-hour lecture into 1 hour. So yeah, I have some questions for you to think about when you go away. Think if you have signing students, or maybe you've had them in the past, how did you or how do you collect data? What assessments, how often? What do you do with those results? Where do you put them? How can people find them? Secondly, have you collected data over time regularly? And also, what do you do with that information? Like, you've got the scores, great. What do you do? How does it impact on your planning? And the rest of you don't have students who sign. Are there any issues about the assessment of sign languages that you hadn't realised, that you hadn't thought about, or that's impacted you from today? And secondly, if you go to a school and you don't sign fluently, and someone comes up and says, can you assess this child? What would you do? How would you go around that? What would you do to collect information about that child's language skills? Just have a think about those questions. So thank you very much, and I hope it's all been clear. It's the first time I've presented in front of a camera, so if it's not clear, please let me know. And we can also talk on the discussion board if you have any questions. Thank you.